All right, well, how are we all doing there out there, Fiveable? Thanks so much for joining. Looks like there's already a lively chat going on. Got food recommendations. Always a good topic of discussion. As we get going, I see some people have already answered the poll, but I threw up a couple poll questions in relation to all the stuff that's happening right now. So if you want to go ahead and just answer those real quick, we will get going. My name is Mr. Liddle, and today we're going to be talking about technology, right? We're going to talk about technology. And specifically, we're going to talk about technology with Unit 3 and Unit 4. Now, if some of you might have seen my last stream where we talked about the Cold War, I announced that this particular stream is going to be about the 20th century. But as some of you may be aware, there was a bit of a change to the AP test this year. They've mixed up the formatting a little bit, and now we're not going to have the 20th century on the AP exam. And so this particular presentation was modified to focus on parts of the course that are going to be on the exam. So we're still going to look at technology. We're just going to go ahead and look at technology on a different part of the course. Now, if you're streaming with us for the first time today, I'd like to just let you know that Fiveable does all sorts of AP topics, from the social sciences to the regular sciences to math and English, whatever you need, we got you. We have a weekly stream calendar, so you can go ahead and check that out. Of course, things are a little bit in flux right now, so just keep checking Fiveable.com for the upcoming streams for AP World or any other APs that you might need help with in general. So, we'll plug out of the way. Of course, thank Fiveable. We are here on Twitter, we're here on Instagram, and we're also here on YouTube. Whatever you need, we are here to help you. So I want to kick off today with a little bit of reflection, just because things are just changing every day by the minute. So what I'd like you to first do is just take a second and think about these three questions, right? First of all, how are you doing? How are we feeling? Right? How do we feel about the changes to the AP exam this year? All the craziness, right? All the insanity. But in light of all of that, all the craziness and all the insanity, what I'd love it if you could do in chat is just talk about something positive that's happening in your life right now. What's something positive going on in your life right now? There's a lot of negatives out there in the world, a lot of negative things happening. What's a positive going on in your life right now? Right? A good thing. A nice video game. A good video game? Yeah, that's true. I gotta say, and it may differ by location, but where I've been, the weather has been nice and moderate. Not too hot, not too cold. A little bit of rain, but not too much. So I've been very grateful that the weather has maintained itself. Spending time with family, yes. That, in and of itself, I think is a positive that I sometimes think we all forget about a little bit. Jason says cleaning. Well, never a bad time to clean. Layla says the opportunity to take care of my health. That's a big one. That's true. Got to talk to the boys on FaceTime for like 2 hours. Well, nothing like spending some time with the boys. That's true. Yard work. I agree. Yard work is an important thing. A lot of time to watch history movies. Well, there are a lot of good history movies out there. Catching up on a little bit of sleep. Yeah, that's also good. So, you know, we do live in crazy times. Things are a little weird. But, you know, part of the way we get through all this is to just think of the positives while things go a little crazy. It's just good to think about the positives. Do I have history movie recommendations? I have a few. Some that might get attached to this particular stream, but at the very end, if you want, I'll give you some recommendations based on topics. So I'll give you some recommendations at the end of the slide. Just keep some topics in mind, and we'll get to that at the end of the streams. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to ask you guys about is, has everybody seen the official announcements about how the AP World exam is going to be administered this year? Has everyone seen that? Yeah, it's going to be a little different this year than normal. It's going to be online. It's going to be not handwritten. So it's going to be online, and it's going to be 45 minutes, and it's only going to be free response questions. So it's only going to be free response questions. That means no multiple choice questions. And so that's kind of a big difference than what we've been doing for a long time, in a lot of years. So that's a big change. That's a big change. And it's also only going to be on units 1 through 6. So it's only going to go up to the 19th century, or the 20th century. So basically, it's going to stop at imperialism, which again is why this stream was actually originally going to be about units 7, 8, and 9, but I had to revamp it because units 7, 8, and 9 won't be on the exam. Will there be an LEQ? You know, they haven't actually said yet what the free response is going to be. All they've said is that there will be free response. So April 3rd, that's next Friday, they'll let us know. Anywho. Any other questions about that before we go ahead and get going? And again, as always, you can throw a little question in the question box while we're going through if I ever talk about things that are unfamiliar or that you're not certain about. All right. Then let's really quick, this is what we're going to do today. We're going to talk a little bit about technology in AP World. We're going to talk about specifically Unit 3. We're going to talk about specifically Unit 4. And in between, we'll do some free response practice. So you'll get a chance to flex your free response skills. We're going to flex our free response skills. So let's talk really quick about technology. So technology is one of the 6 themes in AP World. There used to only be 5 themes. Now there's 6. Does anyone remember the other 5? You might have, your teacher might have given you something called a spice chart or a Persia chart or a Sprite chart, which includes the T for technology. They're acronyms for the 5 themes. Or pirates, that's another one, yes. Pirates. Accused, could you break down what the pirates means for us? Or just as best you can remember. Politics is one of them. Human interactions with the environment is another one. Religion and culture are another one. Art and architecture, which I think falls under the culture one again, but that's still a big one. Trade and economics is a big one. And then there's the social one, right? So there's the 5 big themes of AP World, and then they added the 6th one on, which is technology. Now, technology used to just kind of be stuffed in there under social, but I think one of the good things about the redesign was giving technology its own theme. That means that certain units certain topics within the units now focus exclusively on technology. But if you look in Unit 3 and Unit 4, there's actually only one topic that is explicitly about technology, and that is Unit 4, Topic 1, which talks about technological innovations during the same time of Unit 3 and Unit 4. But this specifically talks about maritime technology, boats, ships, navigational tools, and charts. And the great thing about that is we already have a stream on that. So if you want to know more than you ever wanted to know about, ships and trade and technology and the roots of the age of exploration, like Prince Henry the Navigator and the Carvel and the Galleon and the Flucht, you can go ahead and check out this stream that's linked in here. I also did that one. So that's going to be your maritime technology stream if you want to check that out. But today we're going to talk about other technologies that are not explicitly listed as technology units, but are nonetheless really important for kind of understanding, Unit 3 and Unit 4. So we're going to talk about some technologies there. Any questions before we get going? Okay, then let's go ahead and dive right on in. Let's talk about gunpowder. So, does anybody by chance happen to actually know the origin of gunpowder, how it was discovered? Accidentally, of course, as many great discoveries in history are. Does anyone know the accidental origin story of gunpowder? It was in China, that's true. And on top of that, I'll throw another question out there. Does anyone know the original purpose of gunpowder? Its original purpose was not for guns, believe it or not. Yeah, fireworks. Originally, these were just used for fireworks. That's true. So how do you get gunpowder? Well, you have Taoist monks, and remember, Taoism is one of the great religious movements, ideological, ethical movements of medieval China, which used to be taught in this course, but isn't taught anymore. Nonetheless, still makes an appearance. But they were trying to find an elixir for immortality by mixing together common material substances. And as it turns out, they mixed a little bit of saltpeter and fire one day, and bada boom, quite literally, invented an explosive powder, right? And originally this was used for fireworks in great celebrations, but eventually they would be used for guns, right? It took a long time, though, to get to guns, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. But you might have also heard in your textbook about something called the Islamic gunpowder empires. Does anybody know which empires I'm talking about? There's a couple. They're very famous. Sometimes some textbooks just call them the Islamic empires, but other textbooks explicitly call them the gunpowder empires. So we got the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. Yeah, those are the big three. There's actually a couple other ones that you could include in there. But if we're sticking with just the Islamic ones, then yeah, it's the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. And what does it mean to call something a gunpowder empire? Why do they have this title bestowed upon them? Does anybody know why? It is somewhat self-obvious, but I'll just go ahead and throw it out there. Why call an empire a gunpowder empire if gunpowder doesn't originate within these empires? We know it comes from China. Why call it a gunpowder empire? Were they the first to gain industrial weapons such as guns? Heavily adopted guns into their military? Yeah, I think those are both pretty correct answers, right? In the sense that they hit the mark, right? They didn't necessarily invent guns, but they did incorporate guns, right? And they did so on a much larger scale than a lot of other powers, right? They utilized gunpowder, a very big deal, right? To consolidate their military power, right? Now, of course, these three empires were not the only ones to do it. For example, Russia also is sometimes considered a gunpowder empire, as well as the state of Songhai in Africa is sometimes also considered a gunpowder empire, because while they didn't use guns on such a large scale, they did use firearms. And so gunpowder empires are any state that uses gunpowder to solidify their state power, right? And specifically when we're talking about the states of Asia, like China, right? One thing that guns have is a massive advantage over horse nomads. Now, China, throughout most of its history, has just been bedeviled by horse nomads from the north, right? There's one in particular that you can probably all think of, the most famous group of horse nomads to ever come out of northern Asia. Does anyone know the name? John Green's favorite exception? The Mongols, yes. That's correct. Now, some of you may know that the Mongols themselves used gunpowder in their later conquests, but for states such as China, who always had to deal with horse nomads, Gunpowder was a big leg up, so to speak. It was a huge leg up over these horse nomads who would just devastate their empires time and time again. And so my question for you guys is, since we've talked a little bit about the advantages of guns, what other advantages would firearms bestow upon ruling elites or empires? So in addition to being able to have a strong military, why else would rulers be interested in equipping their soldiers with firearms, right? What's the motivation, if you will? Blowing things up? Well, guns are pretty good at blowing things up. And of course, I haven't even talked about cannons yet. That's a huge one, right? A show of force, control over people, to take down walls. That's true. Guns and cannons are very good at knocking down walls. That's true. A display of power, yeah. That's display of power. You can always go back to power on that, right? A display of power. That's true. A display of power. Well, we're going to get more into this in just a second. So I want to have you take a look at two paintings, one on the left and one on the right. Now, these are both battle paintings of famous battles that maybe you may or may not have heard of, but that's okay, even if you haven't. What I'd like you to do is go ahead and take a look at what do you see, just kind of looking at these two paintings. What do you see? These battles were actually about the same time period. They're about 50 years apart and in totally different parts of the world. But what do you see when you just kind of look at these two battles? Let's see. Yeah. Presence of cannons, that's true. Someone's pointing out that there's a lot of horses, right? And a lot of guns on one side, horses on another side. Completely different art styles. Well, that is also true. That is correct. Different art styles. Well, they are on different sides of the world, so. So yeah, I think what a lot of you guys are pointing out is that there's a noticeable difference where you see guns on one side and perhaps horses on another side, right? In both of these paintings. If you look on the right side of the left side painting, you see lots of people and horses, and the same thing on the left side of the right side painting, lots of horses, right? And then on the other side, you see lots of guns, sometimes cannons, sometimes guns. New versus medieval tech. Yeah. The gap in the middle between the two armies, yeah. That also happened a lot. So these two battles are really pivotal examples of how guns could have a huge advantage over horses in both of these cases. So for example, Nagashino was a battle in medieval Japan in which a force of horsemen that was about 4 times the size of the defending musketeers was completely annihilated, because the musketeers put themselves behind defended earthworks and just mowed down the horsemen. And Chaldiran, on the right, which was between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, a very similar thing happened. The Safavid Empire had this very, very fanatical cavalry called the Kizobosh, and they just charged the Ottomans' guns and were just annihilated in huge droves. It was just total disaster. So both of these battles demonstrate the power of muskets over traditional horse nomads or horse cavalry. And if you'd like to get an idea about what exactly that looked like, I did put a link to a video clip that's about 10 minutes long from a Japanese TV show from the early 2000s where they reenact the Battle of Nagashino. So you kind of get an idea of just how effective guns could be against horse cavalry. You can take a look at that. It's linked in the resources down below. So that's a little bit about the origins of gunpowder and their use in Asia. But what about Europe? What about Europe? So my first question for you is, if gunpowder originated in Asia, Where do Europeans even get gunpowder from, right? If this technology began in Asia, how did it get to Europe, right? How do we get there? Trade, specifically maybe trade with the Muslims, the Silk Road, possibly. The spread of knowledge, that's true. After all, we can't have gunpowder if the knowledge about how to make gunpowder doesn't spread. Trade between kingdoms, it's also true. The Mongol invasion. So all of these answers are correct to an extent, right? And interestingly enough, historians have a theory about exactly when it came to Europe. There's actually a battle that took place between the Mongols and the Hungarian king in 1241 that is supposedly the date when gunpowder technology was transferred over to Europe. Now, of course, we can't say this with any kind of certainty, but historians seem to note that after this battle, guns became much more common among European militaries. So, Muslim traders working with the Mongols who traveled on the Silk Road, all technically correct to a certain extent. So what were the effects of gunpowder weapons in Europe? Well, you begin to see bigger armies than before, right? You begin to see much larger armies. Now, why would guns suddenly result in larger armies? In my mind, I hear that and I think, well, guns are expensive, aren't they? Right? Why would that suddenly lead to bigger armies if guns are more expensive and they take more time to build? You need more defenses against guns. That's true. Guns may take a long time to build, but how much actual training does it take to use a firearm? It takes less skill to use a gun than a horse, right? Easier to use a gun than a bow and arrow, right? Swords and other weapons are heavier. That's also true, although early guns were pretty heavy. But yeah, that's the thing to keep in mind about guns in Europe is that the number of knights, like guys who got, spent their entire lives training to fight, put on this gigantic suit of armor, get on a horse, and it also has its own suit of armor. And then we're going to ride out of the castle in our suit of armor with our giant horse. And we spent our entire life training. And then some dude with a little stick with some metal in it puts a little bit of powder with fire, and suddenly your entire lifetime of training means literally nothing because now you're dead. Reloading. Luis asks a question about reloading. That was actually a huge issue in the early days. It could take like up to several minutes to reload in the early days. And so, of course, now, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, we have bullets where the powder is inside of a metal shell. But back then, you had to put the bullet and the powder in separately and hope that the battlefield wasn't so wet that your powder would be useless. So, but one of the things, Luis brings up a good point about reloading, is in Europe, we begin to see something called the military revolution, right? Which would standardize how you were supposed to use a weapon. So there are all these pictures from late 1500s, early 1600s Europe that mostly come out of Sweden and Holland, or the Netherlands, where they show soldiers how to reload their firearm in 16 steps, right? Or maybe it was 12 steps, where literally each step was supposed to be done exactly the same way. And everybody would do it exactly the same way. And so you have a situation where firearms become more effective and reloading becomes less of an issue because of what we call the military revolution now. Medieval tactics were outdated and it was time for a new age of technological warfare. That's true. Did they have two lines? And when the first line shot, they went behind and the second line would shoot? They did do that. That was that's the idea of the military revolution, right? It's a specific firing method that would make gunpowder much more effective, right? And they might have had more than two. Some battles show they had 5 or 6 lines. Why would they just stand in a line and shoot? Well, early guns were not very accurate. And if you wanted to inflict a lot of damage on your enemy, you were going to have to put everyone in a line just to hope that 1 or 2 bullets might have found their mark. So in today, it seems a little silly, right, to have people standing in a line and shooting. But back then, it was a big part of military warfare, just because you didn't have any other choice. Anywho's. All right, I got a question for you guys. Thinking a little bit into the future, right? We're thinking Unit 3, now we're thinking into the future, right? Specifically talking about Europe. When would gunpowder weapons play a larger role, right? What role would they play in future expansion? Something to think about. So we're talking Unit 3 and 4, but now we're thinking forward. When did cannons become popular in sea combat? That's a good question. Well, I talk a little bit about that in the other stream about maritime technology, but beginning in the age of exploration, which is what some people are already pointing out, is when cannons were put on guns, or guns were put on ships and called cannons. Guerrilla warfare was not in effect yet. Well, guerrilla warfare as a concept had been used by this time, but the guerrilla warfare that we think about with automatic weapons had not come about yet. That's correct. The age of revolutions, it was going to be a huge thing. Russia's expansion eastward. The age of exploration, right? Cannons on ships were going to be a huge part of European exploration of Africa and India. Right? Wouldn't powder get wet in water? Yes, it would. And that's why if the captain of a ship, you had to keep your powder dry. You had to keep it in these barrels that wouldn't get wet in order to make sure that it would be useful when the time came. Colonization and the conquistadors. Yes, that's true. That's true. So gunpowder would play a very large role in future European expansion. So it's important when we talk about Unit 3, we talk about gunpowder empires, or we talk about Unit 4, the age of exploration of the maritime empires, so we don't forget gunpowder as a technology, as a tool of conquest. Let's talk about printing. Has anybody been taking this time to read books, just out of curiosity? I know we have such a great amount of time off. Has anyone been taking this time to do some reading? Some of you doing some reading, yeah. Printing was a really big deal because printing was the first time that it would be really easy to make books. Now, when I say printing, what am I referring to? I'm referring to a process that involves arranging a set of characters, coating those characters with ink, and then pressing them onto something to be read off of, like paper, right? Fiveable streams over books. Well, I won't say that we don't have good streams. But printing was a really big deal. And just like gunpowder, printing actually has its origins that we know of in Asia, right? And so I've included some pictures here on the right from the Jikji Museum in Korea. Now, Jikji is where the earliest known book printed with metal type was created, right? But printing actually goes even further back than that, to the 800s, when the oldest printed thing we have is from somewhere in the 800s, except the characters that were printed were made of wood, right? They were not made of metal at the time, they were made of wood. It's called woodblock printing, all right? Now, Jikji in Korea is famous for being the first that we know of metal printed book, right? The Jikji manuscript. And there's Jikji is somewhere in central South Korea, and they have a big museum, and it's celebrated as the earliest metal print book in the world. Someone said Gutenberg, and Gutenberg did create the press in Europe, but his was 1415. We'll talk about that in a second. Right? And I want to show you guys something. So what I'm going to quick do is I'm going to unfocus the screen because I happen to have the opportunity to visit the Jikji Museum this summer when I was in Korea. And I was fortunate enough to be given the opportunity to actually create a printed page. And so I have that for you here. I'd like to show it to you. And so what we have here is a page of a manuscript, right? We have a page of a manuscript, and each character you can see here would have been individually placed. Would have been individually placed. So, for example, this character right here, that character is its own little wooden block, and it's placed in a vertical line, followed by that character, and that character, and that character. Then a space character, because notice there's nothing here, followed by more characters and additional characters. So they're lined up vertically. Then they're coated with ink, and then they're pressed onto a sheet of paper. And as you can see here, also it includes illustrations. So this is a story about a father and a son. And you can see they have an illustration to go with the printing. Now, one thing that you think about when you look at stuff like this is that, boy, it took a lot of effort to get all those little wood carvings. And so, wouldn't that take forever? And if you made a mistake, it would be terrible. Yes, it would take a while, but let me ask you this. Would it take longer to arrange them and then press them, or have to rewrite everything for every single page? Right? Because pre-printing, that's how you got your books. They had to be copied by hand. So yeah, arranging the characters in these little metal sheets might take a while, but it would be a lot quicker than having to print it all by hand over and over again. Yes, if you made a mistake, it would be terrible. That's true. So, what are these early books that we have? What are they all about? The ones out of Asia? Well, they're about two things. They are either about Buddhism, pretty much all about Buddhism, or they're about government records, specifically taxes. And this is not unique to Asia. So some of you may have heard of, some of you may have taken ancient history when you were in middle school. You may have heard of something called cuneiform, which was an early writing system in Mesopotamia. We have a lot of cuneiform tablets that we've recovered. Thankfully, mud is very durable. It doesn't tend to break up easily if it's dried and fired and kept in a cave. And so what we have out of Mesopotamia is also government records about taxes. So some things are universal, like taxes. Was this an actual job, or could anybody do it? Well, you did need to know how to use the machine. And I know that in Europe, to be a printer or a presser would have taken a lot of training on the specific press. So it would probably have also been a specialized job. Is the Asian script just a form of cuneiform? Well, cuneiform is a very particular script, right? Cuneiform is a series of vertical, horizontal, and diagonal dashes. The characters in Korean and Chinese and Japanese and other scripts in Asia have their own structures and meanings. So and I'm not a linguist, I don't want to get too deep into this, but the characters that you see here are one script, and cuneiform is the second script. So what about in Europe? So first of all, before we get into printing in Europe, if we know the earliest print shops were in Asia, then how does Gutenberg get his press in Europe? Did the rise of printing in Asia help facilitate the spread of Buddhism to peasants? Well, that's a good question. One of the things you always have to keep in mind about printing is how many people could actually read at the time. The answer is not terribly many could read at the time. But what it might have done is keep Buddhism ideologically consistent, right? Because if you can write down your prayers, and maybe you have one person in the village who can read, you can make sure that Buddhism stays an ideologically consistent religion. And you can also make it possible for Buddhism to spread very far and very wide, because you can literally take the prayers with you as you go. If the people who did the printing were government employed, so they wouldn't say anything against the government, probably not. That's true, right? Printing took a lot of resources, and therefore a government would have probably been one of the earliest groups that would have been able to use it, just because of all the resources that it would take to set up a print shop. How did printing get to Europe? Well, did it develop separately? We have something in history called independent inventions. And so while trade and exchange are often part of things, in the case of the Gutenberg press, there's no evidence that Gutenberg got his ideas from anywhere else, right? It seems like Gutenberg himself had conceived of it from earlier models within Europe, right? It's not that the idea of printing had never been around. He was just the first person to do it successfully in Europe. Now, paper as a technology, paper that we know today, that did come from somewhere else. That came from the Islamic world. Because prior to the 1200s, when paper began to be used throughout Europe, most things have been written on animal skins, which are not particularly good for printing. Nonetheless, Gutenberg's press spread widely throughout Europe. And you can look at this chart right here that shows you just how large the growth of Gutenberg's press was. Right? And so my question would be, and this is sort of already asked a little bit earlier about Buddhism and the peasants, but in Europe, what sort of impact would this sudden spread of movable type have? So someone already asked a question about the peasants, but what other effects might sudden, amazing, movable spread of type might have? News would spread faster. Literacy might increase. Might increase. That's true. Protestant Reformation. Quicker spread of information. That's always true. Possibly the rise of educational institutions. The involvement, the increase in the number of subjects, right? If you can write more books, you write more books about more stuff, yeah. You begin to see the spread of knowledge, right? And all those things are true. News travels quicker, and this includes things like the Protestant Reformation. Which leads us to our first FRQ. So I've got a painting right here. And what I'd like you to do is to go ahead and just examine this painting on the right. You can take a minute and take a look at it. What do we see in this painting on the right? And you can look at the bottom for a little bit of information. What do we see in this painting on the right? See peasants, that's true. A lot of common-looking folk. Luther posting his argument against indulgences. People with books. Well, that's true. You can see a couple of the religious figures in the background. Looks like they're holding something, might be books. Luther and his grievances, right? Nailing his 95 Thesis to the door. So, I have a couple questions. And what I'd like you to do is go ahead and just win one sentence or two. Just go ahead and throw these up into the chat, right? One is, and some people have already gotten to this one, what's the historical development being shown here, right? FRQs will often focus on a historical process. So what's the historical process being shown here? And then the other two ones are asking about causes of this historical process. So some people have already hinted at the historical process. But what are the causes of that process? The sale of indulgences. That was a big one. So dissatisfaction with church hierarchy, that could definitely be one of them. But when you get a question like this that asks about the development of the Protestant Reformation, what else could you talk about in addition to just the standard line about selling indulgences? Because that's true. That was a direct cause of the Protestant Reformation, right? That's the more direct cause. But what about perhaps some other underlying causes of the Protestant Reformation? So for example, think about it like this. The Protestant Reformation may have been directly caused by the sale of indulgences, but what allowed it, what other developments would allow it to, say, spread so far and become so popular? Humanism, that was a big one. Humanism, that's a bit narrow for AP World, though. That sounds a little AP Euro. And so, coronavirus says, printing press. Yeah, so the reason why I bring this up is because one of the things about technology, when we talk about technology and other units, is that, yes, the Protestant Reformation was a cultural change, right? It was a cultural event, social change, had some politics in there, but would not have been possible without the printing press. So this is when I talk about looking at these events through the lens of a technological point of view, right? So you might get an FRQ that asks about the Protestant Reformation, and one thing you can say is that there was a technological component. Let's see. Yes, someone's explaining indulgences. Okay, that works. Process of this image caused by Luther's theological disagreements with the church, and then the invention of the printing press facilitated the spread of these ideas. Yes, there we go. You got it. Okay. We're going to go ahead and move on. Any questions about Unit 3 before we dive into Unit 4? Okay. Then we'll go ahead and take a look at Unit 4. We're going to start with another picture. A lot of pictures today. So here's a picture of a sugar plantation. Here's a picture of a sugar plantation. Now, Unit 4, being the Maritime empires, is all about the Europeans and their empires in the Americas, right? And so on the right, we have a painting, a woodcut painting, of a sugar plantation somewhere in a Spanish colony. So I'd like to take a look at this, and what stands out to you? What stands out to you here? Let's see. Some people said the attire. Some said the encomienda system. This is typically used as a picture that describes the encomienda system. That's true. The wheel. People performing various steps in the process of making sugar. A coercive labor system. Lack of advanced technology. The workers look European and not Native American or African. That is also a nice observation. Yes, these would definitely not have been Europeans. These would have been either African slaves or perhaps native laborers. But notice how they're drawn, not just like Europeans, but like ancient Greeks. This is a very ancient Greek-looking painting. So that's true. So, real quick question before we talk a little bit more about sugar plantations. Why were sugar plantations such a big deal amongst these European empires? Why was one of the main elements of the Portuguese Brazilian Empire all about sugar? A lot of people saying money, but sugar is not money. Oh, the demand for sugar, right. The high demand for sugar. Went with tea and coffee, that's true. It was extremely profitable, right? Became a staple food. Fun fact, before sugar was introduced to Europe on a massive scale, they used to get all of their sweetness from one source. Does anybody know what that was? All their sweetness came from one source. It was honey, yes. Honey was the only natural sweetener available for most people, was honey. So, a little bit about a sugar plantation. You can take a look at this picture to kind of get at what I'm getting at. So a sugar plantation would have all of the sugar growing, right? But it would also have a processing facility, right? And so in harvesting and refining sugar, there were many steps. First, you had to actually harvest the sugar, which was incredibly hard to do because sugar cane is very heavy and thick. So that's why you need a machete to harvest it. You would need to press the cane to get the juices out. You then need to boil the juices to clean them up. You'd need to let the juices crystallize into the little teeny tiny sugar granules that we're used to today. And then you'd need to pack those sugar granules either into a barrel in the old days, or today you'd pack it into like a little bag of paper, like you pick it up at the store. Was sugarcane available at the time in the ancient world? Yes, but not much outside of India and the Middle East, South Asia and the Middle East. So each of those steps that I've just described, the harvesting, the pressing, the boiling, the crystallization, and the packing, had a team of people working on it, whose job was only to accomplish that task, right? The harvesting team, the pressing team, the boiling team, the crystallization team, the packing team. And so my question is, does this sort of organization sound familiar? Right, we have teams of people, each one doing a very specific job, and only that specific job, in order to make something faster. I'm seeing division of labor, specialization of labor, the factory, the assembly lines, specialization. Yeah. This sounds a lot like some stuff from the Industrial Revolution, doesn't it? And so take a look at these two photos. On the left, you have a sugar plantation, and on the right, you have a textile factory. What similarities do you notice between these two photos? You have workers working in a line. Everyone's doing the same thing. Both men and women working, that's true. Children as well, yes. Child labor. So, one thing to keep in mind about sugar plantations, if you were to get an FRQ about maritime empires, right, you can make the case that sugar plantations were very similar to the way industrial factories would later be organized, right? And so you can make the connection between industrial organization and the plantation model that was developed in Unit 4 during the colonization of the Americas. Any questions about that before we move on? Could that be the complexity point? I think that would be an excellent point for a complexity point. I think if you could make that connection, you might impress your reader very much if you could make that connection. It's a good way to think about a lot of these points, right? A lot of this could be considered complexity. Cool. Let's talk really quick about textile production. Quick quiz question. The British East India Company traded a lot of things, but what was the most valuable thing they traded by sheer volume of what it was worth and how much it was traded? Spices, teas, cotton. Well, believe it or not, the thing that was most carried by the British East India Company by volume was actually textiles. And by textiles, I mean clothing, carpets, rugs, drapes, tapestries, right? This was the most traded thing. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, Mr. Little, wait a minute. I know that they imported a lot of tea and spices into Europe. Wouldn't that be the more traded thing? And the answer is that's true. One of the major imports of the East India Company was tea and spices into Europe, but they traded in other parts of the world too. And in places like Southeast Asia and in places like Africa, textiles from South Asia were so in demand that they actually formed the majority of what the East India Company did across all of its business interests. How many of you guys have heard of the triangle trade? It's mentioned in Unit 4, right? This trading system between the Americas and Africa and Europe. How many of you guys have heard of this triangle trade thing, right? They often claim, it's often described as like trading guns for slaves, or sometimes like molasses or sugar for slaves. But as it turns out, most of what was traded for slaves that would later go work in the Americas, at least in the British colonies, was textiles from South Asia. This is what African leaders were demanding more than guns or molasses or sugar or alcohol, right? And so it's important to keep in mind that textile production was a huge part of the world during Unit 4. And of course, they were imported to Europe, as you can see from this side. This is a tapestry about Europeans living in what's now South Asia. It was imported into Europe. So, what's so technical about this? Isn't that bad? Since the slaves would also end up wearing those textiles, possibly. So, during the early 1700s, part of what made these textiles so in demand. Now, if you recall reading early in Unit 1 and Unit 2, they talk about the Indian Ocean trade system. And they talk about how cloth from India was highly demanded throughout the world, right? So this is a trend that is not anything new at this point. But during the early 1700s, production in India and South Asia itself is somewhat concentrated. We begin to see the rise of big manufacturing centers, kind of like factories, specifically to create dyes and mordants. Now, mordants is a really technical term. It just means whatever you use to keep the dye in place. If you look at this example on the right, notice that the different colors are very specific, right? You don't want the color of the flower bleeding over into the color of the stem. Right? And so a mordant helps keep the dye in place so it doesn't bleed over. And so producing these took a lot of industrial organization, right? And in particular, historians have pointed to production centers in the north in what's now Rajasthan in India and Pondicherry in the south, which is also in India, as big textile producing centers, right? Where they had these industrial manufacturing centers. And so, how popular were these textiles? How much in demand were they? weavers in England, even after they managed to imitate the style from South Asia, these textiles were being manufactured so much in India that even when you had to ship them all the way around Africa to Europe, they were still cheaper than making them in England. And so English weavers demanded an embargo. They said, you need to stop bringing in South Asian textiles. You're going to put us out of business. Right? There were a number of riots, actually, English weavers rioting through what's now London, demanding an embargo. Right? And they eventually did get their embargo. But that didn't mean the East India Company would stop doing business in South Asia. And so my question for you is, how would this demand, this European demand for textiles, right, affect later world history? Think a little bit forward into Unit 5 and Unit 6 and Unit 7. Think a little bit forward. Someone's talking about the cotton industry. Is this the Dutch East India? This is the British East India Company. Affects pop culture. Cotton industry gives way to textiles in Europe to compete with Asian textiles. Leads to industrialization. Increased control of the sources of textiles. Interesting. Interesting. There's a lot to be said about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but part of the reason that it begins is in part because Europeans need a way to compete with the cheap textiles coming out of South Asia. Now, why were things so cheap in South Asia? There's a lot of factors that go into that, but one of the basic, more simple ones is that in South Asia, agriculture was so productive, food was so cheap, that cotton weavers and textile weavers could create their work with such little amounts of pay, relatively speaking, because food was so cheap. Also, the fact that South Asia is one of the large population centers in world history. In the 1600s, South Asia might have had somewhere in the range of 200 million people living there, whereas all of Europe might have only had somewhere in the realm of 80 million, right? And England itself, maybe something like 10 million, right? So in terms of volume, just sheer volume, England can't compete with South Asia until a certain development that Layla has pointed out, right? Industrialization finally allows Europe to compete with the South Asian textile market. And so read this excerpt on the right. Go ahead and just give this a read. Go and read this excerpt on the right. And then I have a few questions that I'm just going to throw up here. So I'm going to read this excerpt on the right. And then go ahead and take a stab, maybe try to throw a little description of this author's point of view and then the historical context of this document. So the journalist is native to the area. That's true. Point of view is from the European, so they would only see it as good and stopping the textiles from India. Scottish journalist looking at the causation of events. Person was in favor of the embargo, maybe. I would also encourage you to, when we think about the point of view as well as the context, is to consider the date. So by 1874, right, the Industrial Revolution was well underway. And so this is kind of a look back, so to speak. Cheap and popular textiles from India were heavily demanded and were terrible for the textile manufacturers in their own countries. As Europeans would have probably preferred cheaper imported textiles, this journalist is probably not much of a consumer. Well, so one thing about historical context is to consider is that, yes, this was written at the height of the Industrial Revolution, right? The 1870s. The Industrial Revolution in Britain gets its start in the early 1800s. This is maybe like 60 years down the road, right? Kind of looking back at it. So something to think about, right? You could talk about the Industrial Revolution being at its peak. You could also talk about imperialism also being near its peak. At this time, Britain had full control over South Asia, right, including the areas where these cotton textiles had originally been produced. And so it's important to keep in mind the world context when we're looking at these. And the point of view of the author, as some of you pointed out, he's a journalist, right? He's writing a book about history, right? So he's probably an educated person, probably someone who has access to information the average person wouldn't. Probably takes a very academic view of all this. Maybe he's looking at the embargoes favorably, or the importation of cheap textiles favorably, because without it, there wouldn't have been an industrial revolution, just like somebody said in chat. How if things had gone different, Europe would have still been reliant on these imports. Is this a primary source even though it's after the Industrial Revolution started? Well, that's a good question. Well, the Industrial Revolution is an ongoing process, right? Which means that depending on what part of it you're looking at, it could have been a primary source, right? So maybe it's a primary source for the later Industrial Revolution, or maybe not the earlier one. I mean, it's possible that this person was around. If he literally died 1 year after he wrote this, he could have been old enough to see the rise of the original textile mills, possibly. The limitation of the Indian textile industry, allowing for the cotton industry to grow with the Industrial Revolution, right? Limiting the Indian textile industry, right, via the embargoes. So, all right, some good feedback, good contributions there. Any questions? We're about to wrap this on up, but any other overarching questions? So, in conclusion, right, the purpose of this stream is to get you to kind of think a little bit more about the technological lens of Unit 3 and 4, that there's a lot more than meets the eye, right? And especially if we're talking about complexity points, right? How you can look at technologies like printing and gunpowder, not just as evidence of social and political change, but also technological change, and textile production as well as sugar plantations as not just economic and trade related, but also technological concepts. What essay do you expect the College Board would give in 45 minutes if you had to guess? You know, I just couldn't say. I think we're all going to have to wait until April 3rd to find out exactly what it is they're going to do. But I will say that Fiveable is committed to making sure that our streams are about stuff that's actually going to be on the exam, as evidenced by the fact that I changed this original stream from units 7, 8, 9 to units 3 and 4. So we're committed to making sure that you have what you need to do well in the exam. Anywho's, alrighty. So if there are no other questions, somebody was asking earlier about movie recommendations, good for the exam. Well, good question. There's so many movie recommendations. William, you want to give me a time frame, perhaps? A unit, maybe I could give you a movie. Say Unit 5. So Unit 5 would be the revolutions and the Industrial Revolution. Gandhi, Hacksaw Ridge. Well, both of those are a little bit outside of the time. French Revolution. You know, there's a really good, I don't know about any dramatic versions of the French Revolution. I will say that there's a great 4-part History Channel documentary about the French Revolution, as well as A Tale of Two Cities, which is a fictional story, but it's also about the French Revolution. You can find, I believe they made a movie of it in the 1970s, and you can find that on YouTube, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Like I said, I think we're just going to hang tight till next Friday and find out about exactly what it is that it's going to look like. And until then, we're going to help you get exactly what you need. But if there's no further questions, I'm going to let you guys go. Thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, think Fiveable. We're here to help you. Everybody have a lovely rest of your days. Stay healthy, stay well, take care of yourselves, take care of your families, and have a good day.